Marcus Chen had been training in martial arts since he was 7 years old. Now, at 32, he held a black belt in Taekwondo and had won multiple national championships. His kicks were legendary in the competitive circuit. Friends called him Lightning because his strikes came so fast that opponents barely saw them coming. He had dedicated his entire life to perfecting his craft, spending hours every day in the dojo, practicing forms, sparring with partners, and conditioning his body to become a weapon of precision and control. But Marcus had a problem. Despite all his achievements and the respect he commanded in martial arts circles, he struggled to make ends meet. Teaching classes at a small gym in downtown Seattle barely paid his rent. His dreams of opening his own training facility seemed further away with each passing month. Competition prize money helped occasionally, but it wasn't enough to build the life he wanted. When his old college friend David called him with an unusual job opportunity, Marcus was intrigued. David worked for a private security company that specialized in high-profile clients. They needed someone with exceptional martial arts skills to join their team for a special assignment. The pay was substantial, more money than Marcus had ever made in a single month. David explained that a wealthy businessman from a small European nation was visiting Seattle for a technology conference. This businessman was actually a member of his country's royal family. Though he kept a low profile during international travel, Marcus agreed to take the job. He went through a week of intensive training with the security company. They taught him about protection protocols, threat assessment, and how to work as part of a coordinated team. Marcus felt confident. After all, he had been training his whole life for situations that required quick reflexes and decisive action. The security work seemed straightforward enough. Stay alert, maintain a perimeter, and only engage if there was a genuine threat. The assignment began smoothly. The royal businessman, whose name was Prince Stefan, was a quiet man in his 50s who seemed more interested in technology startups than royal ceremonies. He attended conference sessions, met with entrepreneurs, and spent his evenings reviewing business proposals in his hotel suite. Marcus and 3 other security personnel took shifts guarding the prince. Everything was professional and uneventful. On the 4th day of the assignment, Prince Stefan decided to take a morning walk through Pike Place Market. It was a busy Saturday, and the market was crowded with tourists and locals buying fresh fish, flowers, and produce. Marcus stayed close to the prince, scanning the crowd for any potential problems. The other security team members positioned themselves at different points around the market. That's when Marcus noticed him. A man in a dark jacket was moving through the crowd in a way that seemed off. While everyone else stopped to look at vendor stalls or take photos, this man kept his eyes locked on Prince Stefan. He was moving with purpose, weaving between people, getting closer. Marcus's training kicked in. He moved to intercept the man, positioning himself between the stranger and the prince. The man reached into his jacket. Marcus didn't hesitate. In a split second, his body moved on pure instinct. Years of training took over. He saw a threat, and he responded the way he had been taught since childhood. His legs swung up in a perfect roundhouse kick, connecting solidly with the man's face. The stranger went down hard, collapsing onto the wet pavement of the market. People screamed. The crowd scattered. Marcus's fellow security team members rushed forward. Prince Stefan was quickly surrounded and moved away from the scene. Marcus stood over the fallen man, adrenaline pumping through his veins, ready for whatever came next. He had protected his client. He had done his job. But as Marcus looked down at the man he had just kicked, something felt wrong. The stranger wasn't reaching for a weapon. He wasn't trying to get up or fight back. Instead, he was groaning in pain, his hands covering his face. Blood seeped between his fingers. His dark jacket had fallen open, and Marcus could see what was inside the pocket. It wasn't a gun or a knife. It was a small leather wallet. 2 Seattle police officers who had been patrolling the market ran over. They knelt beside the injured man and carefully helped him sit up. One officer picked up the wallet that had fallen from the man's jacket. He opened it and examined the contents. Then he looked up at Marcus with an expression that made Marcus's stomach drop. The officer stood and walked over to Marcus. He held up the wallet so Marcus could see the identification card inside. It was a diplomatic credential. The man Marcus had just kicked in the face wasn't an attacker. He was a royal guard from Prince Stefan's own security detail, a protection officer from the prince's home country, who had been assigned to provide additional security during the trip. Marcus felt the world tilt beneath his feet. The royal guard was part of the team. He had been doing exactly what Marcus was doing, watching the prince, staying close, ensuring his safety. The reason he had been reaching into his jacket was probably to show his credentials to Marcus, to identify himself as a fellow security professional. David rushed over, his face pale. He spoke quickly with the police officers, showing them documentation about the security assignment. Prince Stefan himself had stopped and turned back, concerned about the commotion. When he saw his own royal guard sitting on the ground with blood streaming from his nose, his expression changed from concern to anger. The guard was helped to his feet by the police officers and paramedics, who had arrived on scene. His nose was clearly broken, already swelling and turning purple. He looked at Marcus with a mixture of pain and something else that Marcus couldn't quite read. It wasn't anger exactly, it was more like disappointment, or perhaps pity. Marcus tried to apologize. The guard simply shook his head and allowed the paramedics to lead him away to an ambulance. David pulled Marcus aside, away from the growing crowd of onlookers who were recording everything on their phones. The security company supervisor was already on the phone, speaking in urgent tones. Prince Stefan was escorted back to his hotel under heavy guard. Marcus stood in the middle of Pike Place Market, his perfect kick having created a perfect disaster. Everything he had trained for. All the discipline and control he had developed over 25 years of martial arts had led him to this moment. He had struck first and asked questions later. He had treated a fellow security professional as a threat. He had embarrassed himself, his company, and potentially created an international incident. The police took statements from everyone involved. Marcus explained his reasoning, how the man had seemed suspicious, how he had reached into his jacket. The officers were professional, but skeptical. One of them pointed out that if Marcus had taken just 2 more seconds to assess the situation, he would have seen that the man wasn't actually threatening anyone. He was simply trying to coordinate with the security team. As Marcus gave his statement, he kept replaying the moment in his mind. The kick had been perfect. His form had been flawless. His speed and accuracy had been exactly what he had spent decades perfecting. But perfection and technique meant nothing if he struck the wrong target. All his training had focused on how to fight, not when to fight. He had learned to react with devastating speed and power. But no one had truly prepared him for the complex reality of real-world situations where split-second decisions carried consequences beyond the controlled environment of a tournament. Or a dojo. David finished his phone. Colin walked back to Marcus with a grim expression. The security company was terminating Marcus's assignment immediately. They would pay him for the days he had worked, but he was no longer part of the team. The company had to maintain its reputation. And what had happened at the market was exactly the kind of incident that could destroy their credibility with high-profile clients. Marcus rode back to his apartment in a daze. His phone began buzzing with messages from friends who had seen videos of the incident online. Someone had captured the entire thing on camera, and it was already spreading across social media. The comments were brutal. Some people called him a hero for protecting the prince. Others called him incompetent for not recognizing a fellow security officer. Many simply made jokes about his overreaction. That evening, Marcus sat alone in his small apartment, still wearing his security company uniform. He had kicked a royal guard in the face, breaking the man's nose and humiliating him in front of hundreds of witnesses. His brief career in private security was over before it had really begun. The substantial paycheck he had been counting on would now barely cover the days he had worked. His reputation in the security industry was probably ruined, but something else bothered Marcus even more than the professional consequences. It was the look on the royal guard's face after the kick. Not anger, but disappointment. As if the guard had expected better from someone who claimed to be a martial arts expert. As if Marcus had revealed himself to be exactly what he feared he might be underneath all the belts and trophies. Someone who had learned to fight, but not to think. Someone who had mastered technique, but not wisdom. The next morning, Marcus woke to dozens of missed calls and messages. The video of him kicking the royal guard had gone viral overnight. News outlets were picking up the story. Some framed it as a comedy of errors, others as a serious security failure. His name was trending on social media, though not for the reasons he had once hoped his martial arts skills might bring him recognition. His phone rang again. It was the owner of the gym where Marcus taught classes. The conversation was brief and uncomfortable. Parents had been calling, concerned about having their children trained by someone who had shown such poor judgment. The gym owner suggested Marcus take some time off until things calmed down. It was phrased as a suggestion, but Marcus understood. It was actually a suspension. Marcus spent the day trying to process what had happened. He watched the video of himself over and over, analyzing the moment frame by frame. His technique had been perfect. The kick landed exactly where he had aimed it. But watching it from an outside perspective, he could see what the police officer had meant. If he had waited just 2 more seconds, he would have seen the royal guard's body language more clearly. The man hadn't been moving aggressively. He had been reaching slowly into his jacket, the kind of controlled movement security professionals make when they're about to show identification. That afternoon, Marcus received an unexpected email. It was from someone named Colonel Henrik Nordstrom, identifying himself as the chief of royal security for Prince Stefan's home country. The email was formal but not hostile. It requested that Marcus attend a meeting the following day at Prince Stefan's hotel. The purpose of the meeting was to discuss the incident and its implications. Marcus's hand shook as he read the email. This was it. He was probably going to be sued or possibly face criminal charges for assault. The royal guard he had kicked was a diplomatic official. Marcus had no idea what kind of legal protections that might involve, but he suspected they were significant. He spent the evening consulting with a lawyer friend, who advised him to attend the meeting but to be careful about what he said. The next morning, Marcus dressed in his best suit and took an Uber to the luxury hotel where Prince Stefan was staying. Security personnel checked his identification at 3 different checkpoints before allowing him to proceed to a private conference room on the top floor. His heart pounded as he rode the elevator up. Colonel Nordstrom was waiting in the conference room, along with 2 other officials Marcus didn't recognize. But what surprised Marcus most was that the royal guard he had kicked was also there. The man's face was a mess of bruises, both eyes blackened, his nose splinted and bandaged. Yet he stood at attention with perfect military bearing. His uniform crisp and professional. Colonel Nordstrom gestured for Marcus to sit. The colonel was a man in his early 60s with steel gray hair, and the weathered face of someone who had spent a career dealing with dangerous situations. He studied Marcus for a long moment before speaking in English with a thick accent. He explained that the royal guard Marcus had struck was named Lieutenant Carl Anderson, a decorated officer with 15 years of service protecting the royal family. Marcus opened his mouth to apologize, but the colonel raised his hand. He wasn't finished. The colonel explained that Lieutenant Anderson had filed no complaint and had no intention of pressing charges. However, the incident had raised serious concerns about security coordination and training protocols. It had also, the colonel said with what might have been the hint of a smile, taught them all a valuable lesson about communication. Then the colonel said something that shocked Marcus. He asked if Marcus would be interested in coming to their country for a month to participate in a joint training program. The Royal Security Service wanted to improve how their officers worked with local security contractors in foreign nations. They needed someone who understood both martial arts combat and the American approach to private security. Someone who had made a very public mistake and learned from it. Marcus stared at the colonel in disbelief. This had to be some kind of joke or trap. Why would they want him to train their security forces after what he had done? The colonel seemed to read his confusion. He explained that Lieutenant Anderson himself had suggested Marcus for the program. The lieutenant believed that Marcus's skills were exceptional, but his judgment needed refinement. The kind of refinement that comes from training with people who had been protecting royalty for generations. Lieutenant Anderson spoke for the first time, his voice nasal because of his broken nose. He said that when Marcus had kicked him, the technique had been flawless. The power and speed had been remarkable, but technique without wisdom was dangerous. The lieutenant had spent 15 years learning not just how to fight, but when to fight, and More importantly, when not to fight. He wanted to share that knowledge with Marcus, and in return, Marcus could share his martial arts expertise with the Royal Guard officers. Marcus looked at the lieutenant's battered face and felt a wave of shame. This man, whom Marcus had injured through carelessness, was offering him an opportunity instead of demanding justice. It was the kind of grace Marcus wasn't sure he deserved. He asked why the lieutenant wasn't angry, why he wasn't seeking revenge, or at least compensation. The lieutenant smiled slightly, then winced because smiling hurt his damaged face. He said that anger would accomplish nothing. He had been in dangerous situations around the world, had faced actual threats countless times. A broken nose from a misunderstanding was painful but not tragic. What would be tragic, the lieutenant said, was if neither of them learned anything from the experience. Colonel Nordstrom explained the details. Marcus would fly to their country, all expenses paid, and spend 4 weeks working with the Royal Security Service. He would teach martial arts techniques to their officers and learn their tactical and assessment protocols in return. It would be intensive training, both physical and mental. At the end of the month, Marcus would return home with a certificate of completion and a recommendation from the Royal Security Service. Marcus's mind raced. A month overseas, training with elite security professionals, learning from people who had spent careers protecting some of the most important people in the world. It was an extraordinary opportunity. But he had to ask the obvious question. What about his mistake? What about the fact that he had assaulted one of their officers? The colonel leaned forward. He said that everyone in the security profession makes mistakes. The difference between professionals and amateurs is what they do after the mistake. Amateurs make excuses or hide from consequences. Professionals acknowledge what happened, learn from it, and become better. The colonel believed Marcus had the potential to be a true professional. The question was whether Marcus believed it too. Marcus looked at Lieutenant Anderson, at his bruised face and dignified bearing. He thought about his years of martial arts training, all focused on physical perfection, but lacking in the deeper wisdom of when and how to apply force. He thought about the disappointed look the lieutenant had given him at the market, the look that had haunted Marcus for the past 2 days. He accepted the offer. The colonel nodded approvingly and pulled out paperwork that needed to be signed. Marcus would leave for Europe in 1 week. He would live on the grounds of the royal estate, train daily with the security service, and participate in scenario-based exercises designed to build judgment alongside skill. As the meeting concluded, Lieutenant Anderson approached Marcus. Up close, the damage was even more apparent. Marcus's kick had been devastatingly effective. The lieutenant extended his hand. Marcus shook it carefully, afraid of causing more pain. The lieutenant's grip was firm despite his injuries. He told Marcus that he saw potential in him. It's the kind of potential that could make Marcus not just a skilled fighter, but a wise protector. Marcus left the hotel in a daze. His life had been a disaster 2 days ago. He had lost his security job, been suspended from teaching, and become an internet meme. Now he was being offered a chance to train with elite royal security professionals in Europe. It felt surreal, like the universe had decided to teach him a lesson in the strangest way possible. He spent the next week preparing for the trip. He researched the country he would be visiting, a small but wealthy nation known for its progressive policies and low crime rate. He read everything he could find about royal security protocols and diplomatic protection. He also continued to practice his martial arts, but with a new mindset. Instead of just focusing on speed and power, he began thinking about each technique differently. When should it be used? What were the alternatives? What could go wrong? His lawyer friend was amazed by the turn of events. She had expected Marcus would need to defend himself against a lawsuit, not prepare for an international training opportunity. Marcus's other friends were equally surprised. Some were jealous of the chance to travel and train in Europe. Others thought he was crazy to trust the same people he had attacked. But Marcus knew this was more than just a training opportunity. It was a chance to become something more than a martial arts expert with fast kicks and good form. It was a chance to develop the judgment and wisdom that his training had never emphasized. Lieutenant Anderson had seen something in Marcus worth cultivating, even after being kicked in the face. That kind of grace and professionalism was exactly what Marcus wanted to learn. The night before his flight, Marcus visited his old dojo, where he had trained as a child. His first instructor, Master Park, was still teaching classes there. Marcus told him about everything that had happened. Master Park listened quietly, his weathered face thoughtful. When Marcus finished, the old instructor nodded slowly. He said that Marcus was finally ready to learn what martial arts was really about. Not fighting, but understanding. Not defeating others, but mastering oneself. Marcus boarded the plane to Europe with a mixture of nervousness and excitement. He was leaving behind the familiar world of martial arts competitions and gym classes. He was entering a world where his skills would be tested in ways he had never imagined, where split-second decisions could have consequences far beyond winning or losing a match. As the plane took off, Marcus looked out at Seattle disappearing below. He thought about the moment at Pike Place Market, the perfect kick that had changed everything. His preparation as a martial artist had given him incredible physical abilities, but it hadn't prepared him for the complex reality of using those abilities in the real world. Now he was about to discover what came next, what lay beyond the techniques and trophies. He was about to learn what it truly meant to be, not just a fighter, but a guardian. Marcus arrived in the small European nation on a gray morning in late September. The Royal Security Service had sent a car to pick him up from the airport. As they drove through the countryside toward the royal estate, Marcus watched rolling hills and dense forests pass by the window. The driver, a young officer named Eric, made polite conversation about the weather and the training facility. The royal estate was nothing like Marcus had imagined. Instead of a grand palace, it was a sprawling complex of modern buildings surrounded by forests and training grounds. The royal family maintained this facility specifically for security personnel training. It looked more like a military base than a palace, with obstacle courses, shooting ranges, and multiple training halls visible from the entrance. Lieutenant Anderson met Marcus at the main building. His face had healed considerably, though his nose had a slight new angle to it that would be permanent. He greeted Marcus warmly, showing no trace of resentment. He explained that Marcus would be living in the trainee quarters, a simple but comfortable dormitory where visiting security professionals stayed during intensive training programs. That first day was orientation. Colonel Nordstrom briefed Marcus on the schedule. Mornings would be physical training, combining martial arts instruction with tactical exercises. Afternoons would focus on threat assessment, situational awareness, and decision-making under pressure. Evenings would involve scenario-based training where Marcus would participate in mock protection assignments with other officers. The colonel emphasized one point repeatedly. This training was not about making Marcus a better fighter. It was about making him a better protector. The distinction, he said, was everything. Fighters seek confrontation. Protectors avoid it whenever possible. Fighters measure success in victories. Protectors measure success in threats neutralized without force. The other trainees were security professionals from various countries. There was Sophia, a bodyguard from Spain who protected executives and celebrities. There was James, a former British police officer transitioning to diplomatic security. There was Kenji, a Japanese security consultant who specialized in threat assessment. And there were 6 Royal Guard officers from the host country, all undergoing their annual advanced training. Marcus's first morning of physical training was humbling. He had expected to impress everyone with his martial arts skills. Instead, he found himself struggling to keep up with exercises that emphasized endurance over explosive power. The training focused on maintaining alertness and physical capability over extended periods. Not delivering perfect techniques in controlled bursts, Lieutenant Anderson led the martial arts portion of the training. Despite his injury, he moved with fluid efficiency, demonstrating techniques that emphasized control and restraint rather than devastating strikes. He taught holds designed to immobilize without injuring, tactics for creating distance without escalating confrontation, and methods for protecting clients while managing potential threats. Marcus demonstrated some of his tournament-winning techniques to the group. Everyone was impressed by his speed and precision. But when the lieutenant asked Marcus to apply those techniques in a scenario where he had to protect a client while surrounded by innocent bystanders, Marcus struggled. His powerful kicks and strikes suddenly seemed too dangerous. It's too likely to cause collateral harm. The afternoon sessions were even more challenging. Instructors showed videos of real protection scenarios and asked the trainees to identify threats and appropriate responses. Marcus found himself consistently choosing more aggressive options than necessary, while other trainees would suggest creating distance or calling for backup. Marcus's instinct was always to engage the threat directly. One instructor, a woman named Captain Lundquist, who specialized in psychological threat assessment, pulled Marcus aside after a particularly difficult session. She asked him why he always chose confrontation over alternatives. Marcus struggled to answer. He realized that his entire training had conditioned him to see threats as opponents to be defeated, not problems to be solved. Captain Lundquist explained that protection work required a different mindset. Every confrontation was a failure, even if you won, because confrontation meant your client was exposed to danger. Bystanders might be harmed, and you might face legal consequences. The goal was always to anticipate threats early enough that they could be avoided entirely. The evening scenario training brought all these lessons together in practical exercises. Trainees took turns playing different roles. Sometimes Marcus was the protector, sometimes the client, sometimes even the threat. The scenarios varied wildly. Shopping in a crowded market, attending a public event, dealing with an aggressive paparazzo, responding to a medical emergency in a hostile environment. Marcus failed most of these scenarios at first. His instinct to rely on his physical skills kept overriding his judgment. In one exercise, he physically restrained an aggressive journalist who was actually an undercover officer, testing to see if Marcus could distinguish between annoyance and genuine threat. In another, he focused so intensely on watching for external threats that he missed his client having a medical emergency. After each failed scenario, the instructors would debrief the experience. They never criticized harshly. Instead, they asked questions. What did you observe? What were your options? Why did you choose that action? What might have worked better? The approach forced Marcus to think deeply about his decisions rather than just reacting on instinct. Lieutenant Anderson spent significant time working with Marcus, us individually. During their private sessions, the lieutenant shared stories from his 15 years of service. He talked about assignments where he had successfully protected royalty in dangerous situations without anyone in the public even realizing there had been a threat. He talked about the satisfaction of preventing problems rather than solving them through force. But the lieutenant also talked about mistakes. He described a situation early in his career where he had tackled someone he thought was reaching for a weapon. The person had actually been having a seizure. The lieutenant had responded with force when the situation required compassion and medical assistance. He had nearly ended his career over that mistake. It had taught him to look for multiple explanations before jumping to conclusions. Marcus began to understand that his kick at Pike Place Market hadn't been an isolated error. It had been the inevitable result of training that prioritized physical response over critical thinking. He had become incredibly skilled at executing techniques, but had never learned to question whether executing those techniques was the right choice. The training pushed Marcus in ways his martial arts background never had. There was an exercise where he had to protect a client while wearing a blindfold, relying entirely on verbal communication with his team. There was a scenario where he had to maintain protection, while simultaneously de-escalating a confrontation between his client and an angry family member. There was a simulation where the threat turned out to be coming from inside the security team itself. Slowly, Marcus began to change. His first instinct stopped being to fight and started being to assess. He learned to read body language more carefully, to distinguish between aggressive posturing and actual hostile intent. He learned to position himself and his client in ways that gave him options rather than forcing confrontation. He learned to communicate with his team so that everyone maintained awareness without creating visible security presence that might attract attention. Sophia, the Spanish bodyguard, became a particular friend and mentor. She had protected celebrities for years and had countless stories about managing obsessed fans, aggressive paparazzi, and genuine stalkers. She taught Marcus his techniques for creating psychological distance, making potential threats focus on her rather than her client, and maintaining professional boundaries even under intense pressure. James, the former British police officer, helped Marcus understand legal implications. Every use of force had consequences: assault charges, civil lawsuits, professional liability, public relations disasters. James had seen security professionals ruin their careers and their clients' reputations through overreaction. He taught Marcus to think 3 steps ahead. Before taking any action, consider what happens next, and next, and next. Kenji, the Japanese consultant, introduced Marcus to concepts of threat assessment that went far beyond physical danger: reputational threats, financial threats, social engineering, information security. Kenji explained that most threats to high-profile clients didn't come from people trying to physically harm them. They came from people trying to manipulate, embarrass, or defraud them. Physical skills were useless against those threats. As the weeks progressed, Marcus noticed changes in how he moved through the world. When he walked through the training facility or the nearby town, he no longer cataloged potential opponents. Instead, he identified exit routes, positions of cover, potential resources. His awareness expanded from focusing on immediate threats to understanding entire environments. The instructors introduced increasingly complex scenarios. In one exercise, Marcus had to protect a prince during a public speech where there were 3 simultaneous threats of different types happening: a medical emergency in the crowd, a suspicious package near the stage, and an aggressive protester trying to rush the platform. Marcus had to coordinate with his team to address all 3 situations without creating panic or exposing the client to danger. Marcus succeeded in that scenario by doing something that would have been impossible for him a month earlier. He didn't engage any of the threats personally. Instead, he directed team members to handle each situation while he maintained position with the client, ready to evacuate if necessary, but trusting his team to manage the problems. The old Marcus would have tried to handle everything himself. The new Marcus understood that protection was a team effort. Lieutenant Anderson pulled Marcus aside after that successful scenario. He told Marcus that he had finally begun to understand. Protection wasn't about being the strongest or fastest. It was about being the calmest and wisest. It was about making dozens of small, correct decisions that prevented the need for any dramatic actions. But the lieutenant also warned Marcus that understanding intellectually wasn't the same as responding correctly under real stress. The true test would come when Marcus returned to the real world and faced genuine situations. Would his new training hold up under pressure, or would he revert to his old instincts? To prepare Marcus for that challenge, the instructors designed a final scenario. They didn't tell Marcus when it would happen, or what form it would take. They simply said that sometime in his last week at the facility, he would face a realistic simulation designed to test everything he had learned. The scenario would involve real stress, real confusion, and real consequences for failure. Marcus spent his remaining days training with new intensity. He practiced the mental techniques Captain Lundquist had taught him for staying calm under pressure. He drilled communication protocols with his team until they became automatic. He studied threat patterns and practiced distinguishing between genuine dangers and false alarms. The final scenario came on a Thursday afternoon. Marcus was assigned to protect Colonel Nordstrom. During a visit to a nearby university where the colonel would give a lecture on security practices, Marcus had a team of 4 officers working with him. The setting seemed straightforward, a controlled environment with minimal genuine risk. But as the colonel's lecture began, things started going wrong. A fire alarm went off in the building. As they evacuated, Marcus spotted someone in the crowd wearing a jacket similar to the one the aggressive journalist had worn in an earlier training scenario. In the parking lot, a car alarm started blaring. Then someone in the crowd shouted that they had seen a weapon. Marcus felt his heart rate spike. His old instincts screamed at him to act, to engage threats, to use his skills. But he forced himself to pause. He communicated with his team. He assessed the actual threat level. The fire alarm was a planned drill by the university. The person in the similar jacket was just a student. The car alarm was unrelated. The shout about a weapon came from someone who had seen a security officer's holstered sidearm and panicked. None of it was a real threat. All of it could have caused Marcus to overreact and create an actual dangerous situation. By staying calm, communicating clearly, and assessing carefully, Marcus successfully protected the colonel through the chaos without any use of force or creation of additional problems. When they returned to the facility and the instructors revealed it had been the final test, Marcus felt a profound sense of accomplishment. That evening, Colonel Nordstrom held a small ceremony for Marcus and the other trainees completing the program. He presented certificates and offered individual assessments. When he spoke to Marcus, the colonel said something that resonated deeply. He said that Marcus had arrived as a martial artist and was leaving as a guardian. The difference would define the rest of his career. Asterisk. Sarah's 3 weeks at the basic school were intense, but different from her OCS experience. Here, everyone knew she was already an officer. There was no pretense, no hidden identity, just straightforward training for new Marine lieutenants. She excelled as expected. Her Naval Academy education and OCS observation experience giving her perspectives that most other new officers lacked. But throughout those 3 weeks, Sarah was also working on something else. She spent her evenings writing a comprehensive evaluation report on OCS training methods. The document was detailed and analytical, covering everything from physical training protocols to leadership development strategies to tactical instruction methods. She identified strengths to be maintained and weaknesses to be addressed, backing every recommendation with specific observations from her 11 weeks as a pseudo-candidate. The Marine Corps' leadership was eager to receive her assessment. Training programs were constantly evolving. Having an officer of Sarah's caliber provide detailed feedback was exactly the kind of input they needed to make improvements. But they had also planned something that Sarah didn't know about, something that would complete her OCS assignment in an unexpected way. On the day of OCS graduation for the class Sarah had trained with, she received orders to return to Quantico. The official reason given was that her presence was requested at a training development briefing. Sarah assumed she would be presenting her evaluation report to senior officers at the Marine Corps Education Command. She prepared her presentation materials and made the drive from the basic school back to the OCS facility. When she arrived, she was directed not to an administrative building, but to the parade ground, where graduation ceremonies were held. This was unusual. Sarah was confused, but followed the directions she had been given. As she approached the parade ground, she could see the entire OCS class assembled in formation, dress uniforms perfect. Families and guests seated in viewing areas. A major who Sarah didn't recognize met her at the edge of the parade ground. He told her that her presence was required at the ceremony, but he didn't explain why. He directed her to a position off to the side where several senior officers were standing. Sarah noticed that one of them was a colonel she recognized from photos. The commanding officer of all Marine Corps officer training. The graduation ceremony began with the traditional formalities. The national anthem, remarks from senior officers, recognition of distinguished graduates. Derek had earned honor graduate status, his strong finish in the final weeks outweighing some of his earlier leadership issues. Jennifer had graduated in the top third of the class, a solid performance. Marcus had done better than he expected, finishing in the top quarter. Then the commanding colonel stepped forward and announced that there would be a special presentation before the actual commissioning of the new officers. He explained to the assembled crowd that the Marine Corps was committed to continuous improvement of its training programs, and that occasionally special evaluation assignments were conducted to gather detailed feedback on training effectiveness. The colonel described how Second Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, distinguished graduate of the Naval Academy, had spent 11 weeks attending OCS, as if she were a regular candidate while actually conducting an evaluation of the training program. He emphasized that she had received no special treatment, had completed every requirement alongside the other candidates, had maintained her cover assignment throughout the entire training period. Sarah stood at attention, wondering where this was going. The colonel continued, explaining that Lieutenant Mitchell's evaluation report had just been reviewed by senior leadership and had been found to be exceptionally valuable. Her recommendations were detailed, practical, and demonstrated both tactical expertise and deep understanding of leadership development principles. Then the colonel said something that shocked Sarah as much as it shocked the graduating candidates. He announced that based on her performance during the OCS evaluation assignment and the quality of her assessment report, Second Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell had been selected for immediate promotion to First Lieutenant and had been assigned as the Assistant Director of Training Development for Marine Corps Officer Candidate School. The crowd erupted in applause. Sarah's face remained composed, but her mind was racing. This was completely unexpected. She had thought her OCS assignment was a temporary evaluation project before she went on to regular Marine officer training, an eventual assignment to an operational unit. Instead, she was being promoted early and given a position of significant responsibility at the very facility where she had spent the past 11 weeks being dismissed and underestimated. The colonel motioned for Sarah to join him at the podium. She marched across the parade ground with precise military bearing, saluted, and stood beside the commanding officer. He turned to face her and conducted the promotion ceremony right there, pinning the silver bars of a first lieutenant on her uniform in front of everyone. Then he explained what Sarah's new role would entail. As Assistant Director of Training Development, she would be responsible for implementing improvements to OCS based on her evaluation recommendations. She would work directly with the drill instructors and training staff to enhance tactical instruction, refine leadership development exercises, and ensure that OCS continued to produce the highest quality Marine officers possible. More significantly, the colonel continued, First Lieutenant Mitchell would be overseeing the next OCS class that would begin in 2 weeks. She would be the senior training officer for that class, responsible for their development from arrival through graduation. The drill instructors would report to her. The training schedule would be under her authority. She would be, effectively, the commanding authority for the next generation of Marine officer candidates. Sarah understood immediately what this meant. She would be returning to OCS, not as a dismissed newcomer candidate, but as the senior officer responsible for training. The drill instructors who had watched her struggle through exercises would now be taking guidance from her on how to improve those exercises. The facility where she had been underestimated would now be operating under her direction. After the promotion ceremony concluded, the graduation continued with the actual commissioning of the new second lieutenants. Sarah stood with the senior officers, watching as Derek, Jennifer, Marcus, and all the others she had trained alongside received their bars and officially became Marine officers. When the ceremony concluded and families flooded the parade ground to congratulate the new officers, several of the newly commissioned lieutenants sought out Sarah. Derek approached first. Now understanding fully what had happened over the past 3 months, he had been competing with and dismissing someone who was not only already an officer, but who was also more qualified and experienced than he had realized. Derek apologized sincerely for his earlier dismissiveness. Sarah accepted the apology, but also told him something important. She said that his experience at OCS had been valuable precisely because he hadn't known who she was. He had revealed his natural leadership style, his strengths and weaknesses, without the artificial dynamic that knowing her rank would have created. That authentic experience had taught him things about himself that he needed to learn. Jennifer's conversation with Sarah was more emotional. She felt betrayed by the deception, even though she understood intellectually why it had been necessary. Sarah listened to Jennifer's feelings without becoming defensive, and pointed out that their conversation during the difficult ruck march had been completely authentic. Sarah's advice and encouragement had been real. It's given not from superior rank, but from genuine understanding of what Jennifer was experiencing. Marcus simply congratulated Sarah on her promotion and thanked her for the subtle help she had provided throughout. He told her that he had learned as much from watching how she handled situations as he had from the actual training. Sarah smiled and told Marcus that he had good instincts and that she hoped to see him excel in his career. Over the following days, Sarah moved into her new role at OCS with characteristic efficiency. She met with the drill instructors, some of whom had been her instructors just weeks ago. The dynamic was strange at first, with everyone adjusting to this dramatic reversal of roles. But Sarah's professionalism and the obvious quality of her evaluation report quickly established her credibility. She implemented changes systematically. Some were small adjustments to how certain exercises were conducted. Others were more significant modifications to tactical instruction methods. All were based on careful analysis of what she had observed during her 11 weeks as a pseudo-candidate. One of her first major initiatives was to redesign how leadership under ethical pressure was taught. She had noticed during her time as a candidate that the scenarios often presented false binary choices when real situations usually offered more options if leaders were creative and thoughtful. She worked with the instructors to develop new scenarios that rewarded tactical creativity and ethical reasoning equally. She also addressed the tendency she had observed for instructors to favor physically impressive candidates in their early assessments. Sarah implemented a new evaluation protocol that required instructors to provide detailed justification for their performance ratings, forcing them to assess candidates based on demonstrated leadership ability rather than physical appearance or personality traits. The staff sergeant, who had barely glanced at Sarah on her first day at OCS, was now taking guidance from her on how to improve candidate assessment methods. He had been skeptical initially, but after seeing Sarah's recommendations in practice and observing how they improved the training outcomes, he became one of her strongest supporters. He told other instructors that he had learned an important lesson about not judging people based on first impressions. 2 weeks after the graduation ceremony, the new OCS class arrived. Sarah stood in her officer's uniform watching as the buses pulled up and candidates stepped off, most of them looking nervous and overwhelmed. She saw the same dynamics she had experienced: the confident, athletic types, the uncertain but determined ones, the quiet observers who might be hiding unexpected capabilities. When the platoon assembled for their first formation, Sarah stepped forward to address them. She introduced herself as First Lieutenant Mitchell, Assistant Director of Training Development, and explained that she would be overseeing their training for the next 12 weeks. She saw some candidates assessing her, probably making assumptions based on her age and gender and size. Sarah told them something she wished someone had told her class. She explained that OCS was designed to reveal character under pressure, and that the candidates who succeeded wouldn't necessarily be the ones who looked most impressive on day one. The best Marine officers, she said, were those who could think clearly under stress. I'll lead with both strength and wisdom and maintain high standards while treating people with dignity. She also told them that she had recently completed OCS herself, though she didn't explain the full circumstances. She wanted them to know that she understood what they were about to experience, that her expectations were based on recent first-hand knowledge of what the training demanded. Over the following weeks, Sarah supervised the training with careful attention. She observed how the drill instructors implemented her new protocols, assessed how candidates responded to the modified exercises, and continued refining her recommendations based on what she was seeing in practice. She noticed a candidate in this new class who reminded her of herself, a quiet young woman named Andrea, who was consistently underestimated by her peers. Despite demonstrating solid tactical thinking and steady performance, Sarah made sure the instructors were properly evaluating Andrea's actual capabilities. Rather than making assumptions based on her reserved demeanor, Sarah also noticed a candidate similar to Derek, physically impressive and naturally confident, but sometimes letting ego override judgment. She worked with the drill instructors to provide that candidate with feedback that would help him develop the wisdom to match his physical abilities. The transformation in Sarah's role from dismissed newcomer to commanding authority was now complete. The facility where she had been overlooked was operating under her guidance. The training program that had tested her was being improved based on her recommendations. The drill instructors who had evaluated her were now seeking her approval for their training methods. But Sarah never forgot what it felt like to be dismissed and underestimated. That experience informed every decision she made as a training officer. She pushed her staff to evaluate candidates based on demonstrated performance rather than surface characteristics. She designed exercises that revealed depth of character rather than just physical prowess. She created an environment where quiet competence was recognized as readily as loud confidence. 6 months into her role as Assistant Director of Training Development, Sarah received recognition from Marine Corps headquarters for her innovative improvements to OCS training methods. Her evaluation protocols were being considered for adoption across other training programs. Her tactical instruction modifications had measurably improved candidate performance in complex decision-making scenarios. Senior officers who had initially been skeptical about promoting such a young officer to a significant training role were now citing her assignment as an example of how the Marine Corps could identify and rapidly advance exceptional talent. Sarah had proven that age and appearance were poor predictors of capability, something she had known personally from her OCS experience. She continued to refine the training program, always looking for ways to better prepare new officers for the complex challenges they would face in their careers. She stayed in touch with the officers from her OCS class, tracking their progress and learning from their experiences what aspects of the training had been most valuable and what areas still needed improvement. Derek reached out to Sarah several months after graduation to thank her for the lesson her presence at OCS had taught him. He admitted that his initial dismissiveness of her had revealed a character flaw he was working to correct. He was learning to evaluate people based on their actions and results, rather than his first impressions. Sarah told him that recognizing your weaknesses was the first step toward addressing them, and that she was glad he was taking that growth seriously. Jennifer eventually made peace with the deception of Sarah's OCS assignment. She came to understand that the awkwardness she felt about having been deceived was less important than the valuable training experience she had received. She told Sarah that the memory of their conversation during the difficult ruck march still motivated her when she faced challenges, regardless of Sarah's hidden identity at the time. Marcus thrived in his first assignment as a Marine officer, his quiet competence earning recognition just as Sarah had predicted. He credited his success partly to watching how Sarah had operated during OCS, learning that effective leadership didn't require a loud confidence or aggressive assertion. Sometimes the best leaders were the ones who stayed calm, thought carefully, and acted decisively. Sarah's time at OCS, both as a pseudo-candidate and as a training officer, became something of a legend within the Marine Corps officer community. The story was shared as an example of why assumptions based on appearance were dangerous, why underestimating people could cause you to miss genuine excellence, and why character revealed under pressure was more important than impressive first impressions. 3 years after her OCS assignment, First Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell was promoted to captain and selected for a Special Operations Command position. But she never forgot the lessons from those 11 weeks when she was dismissed as just another newcomer candidate. Those lessons informed her entire career, shaping how she led, how she evaluated others, and how she understood the difference between looking capable and actually being capable. The newcomer cadet, who had been dismissed, had arrived as the commanding authority. But more importantly, she had used that position to ensure that future generations of Marine officers would be trained to recognize capability wherever it existed, regardless of how it looked on the surface. That was her true mission all along, and she had accomplished it in ways that exceeded everyone's expectations except her own.